Hi, welcome to A Push. We're going to be looking at Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we're going to do this in two short videos. The first is really on just context, like what got to the America being in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we had to go back a ways to do that. So one of the first things I want to talk about is the Cuban Revolution, because the Cuban Missile Crisis takes place in Cuba mostly, or around Cuba, so we need to know where Cuba's at this point in the early 1960s. So um, before we get to the 1959 Cuban Revolution, I would remind you where Cuba is. It's good to look on a map. It's only 90 miles from Florida, so pretty close to the United States. And the U.S. has a long history with Cuba, going back to the Spanish-American War in 1898 that you've already studied, as well as it being a greater part of Latin America. And so I would remind you of during the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt's big stick policy, and the U.S. having a lot of influence over a lot of places in Latin America. And at the end of the Spanish-American War, if you remember, Congress passed the Teller Amendment, which basically said in the declaration of war that the U.S. would not stay in Cuba terribly long. And a lot of people came to regret that. So when the war was over and the U.S. helped Cuba write their constitution, they added something called the Platt Amendment, where Cuba was independent, but there were a lot of strings attached. They had to look to the U.S. if they wanted to negotiate a treaty with another nation, that sort of thing. And so when we get to the 1930s, off and on during the 1930s, 40s, and into the 1950s, Cuba was ruled by a dictator by the name of Fulgencio Batista. And the U.S. liked him, especially after World War II, because while he was a dictator, he was not a communist dictator. And at this point, the United States had a lot of interest in Cuba. Their American companies owned all of Cuba's oil production, 90% of their coal mines, about half of their railroads, sugar industry, and cattle industry. And so Batista was not liked by a number of Cubans. And so in 1959, he was overthrown by Fidel Castro, who set up a nationwide system of education, a nationwide system of housing, distributed land to landless peasants, confiscated over 1 million acres of land owned by American companies. And so he wasn't really liked by the United States. He sought aid from the Soviet Union and got it. And so that's kind of where Cuba's at. It's being ruled by a communist dictator by the late 50s, early 60s. Now, if you remember, during the 1950s, the president of the United States was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Eisenhower did a few things that kind of hurt the credibility of the United States. One seems to have nothing to do with Cuba, but it's related. So in 1960, the CIA was authorized to send spy planes up into the upper atmosphere called U-2 spy planes. And Eisenhower had authorized these through the CIA. And in May of 1960, one of these spy planes was shot down over the Soviet Union. And the Soviets, of course, said, haha, we've caught one of your planes. We have the wreckage of it. And Eisenhower denied that. He said, you made up the wreckage or whatever. And then the Soviet Union said, well, we captured the pilot, Francis Gary Powers. And so really in the eyes of the world, Eisenhower lost a lot of credibility. We had gotten caught basically lying about spying on the Soviets. And that's kind of important when we get to the missile crisis.